But let's talk about what was going on in Europe at the same time, okay? And one of the things that had happened, as you guys recall, was that the French and the British wanted to make the Treaty of Versailles a punitive treaty that would cripple Germany and make sure that Germany never threatened Britain and France again, okay? And so one of the ways that they did that was by imposing reparations, as we talked about last week. But another way was that they actually divided Germany up. Germany had really only been unified since about 1870. And after World War I, they broke it up again, and they made really cut Germany in two and created the country of Poland, which really hadn't before that existed for 1,000 years, right? But now they create this new country called Poland that divides Germany up. And then they create a whole bunch of new countries out of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there's, Czechoslovakia and Hungary, Romania, Serbia, all these different countries, right? And so what that did was it weakened Germany, all right? It weakened them particularly economically, because the reparations are going to place a terrible strain on the German economy. And the way that the German economy, or the German government essentially, is going to respond to that is going to be by printing money, all right? And the problem, of course, with printing money is that the money eventually has no value because there's nothing backing it up. It's just a bunch of paper, right? So the people in Germany were really threatening, and this is in the middle of the Great Depression, so everybody's suffering from the Great Depression. But because the government that took over in Germany when the Kaiser abdicated was a republic, but many of the people in the government were actually Jewish. And so the sentiment arose in Germany that the Jews had sold out the country, that they had made a deal with the West and they'd surrendered, even though Germany actually could have won the war. That was the thinking. It wasn't true. Really, none of it was true, right? But that was the thinking. And where that thinking came from was from a guy named Adolf Hitler, who wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means my struggle, right? And in the book, what he said was that Germany had been sold out by the Jews, but that the German race was the master race of the world. His view was a racist view, which was that the top of the kind of racial food chain essentially was the German race. And then after that, there were gradations of greatness, I guess you could say, until you get to the bottom, right? And so what they thought was that Germans were actually the superior race, and then other Scandinavians were just underneath that. And then the British, Anglo-Saxons were underneath that. And then if you get down, like the Americans were way down there because there were people in America from all over the place, right? And then when you got into other colored people, other ethnicities, they were even further down, right? Eastern Europeans were down close to the bottom. They were called Untermenschen, meaning under people, essentially, right? And of course, Black people or Asians are even further down. But then at the bottom, the greatest enemy was, guess who? The Jews, right? Okay, so the idea that Hitler had was that once he took power, or his party, the Nazi party, took power in Germany, that they would first unite all the German people into one country, which we call Greater Germany, or the Third Reich, right? And then once he had done that, then he would turn his attention to Eastern Europe, with the idea being that because Eastern Europe is occupied by Untermenschen, they don't really deserve to control that country. And so the Germans should take it over as a place where they can expand, called Lebensraum, or living space, right? The idea that they can expand into the east, and there's good agricultural country, and there's oil, and so they can expand their greater Germany, and anybody that's in their way should just be exterminated because they're not worth anything. You guys follow what I'm saying? And he said all this right out loud in his book. Okay, and people bought it. People in Germany who are suffering are all of a sudden saying, well, hey, wait a minute, maybe he's right. Maybe these Jews are the real problem, right? Because it gives them somewhere to focus their anxiety, all right? Now, the thing that we should add to this discussion is that Hitler didn't invent anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism had been a European cultural artifact going all the way back to the Roman Empire. Okay, but what Hitler did was he weaponized it. He was able to organize this anti-Semitic feeling in order to be able to gain his own political power, right? And so one of the things that I would like to caution you guys about is that if you see a politician, and it doesn't have to be a foreign politician, but if you see any politician that starts his rise to political power by defining some group as the enemy, whether it's Japanese or whether it's Chinese or whether it's Hispanics or Muslims, right? That person is weaponizing our own worst racist instincts. You guys follow what I'm saying? And the purpose of that is to seize power, because the idea behind that is that, well, if you give me the power, I'm the strong man, and I can solve this problem. All right, you guys get what I'm saying? So this is how authoritarianism starts, and this is exactly what happened in Germany. It also happened in Italy, but not on the same scale. All right, you guys are with me? Questions, comments about this?
I heard that in the U.S. it was very hard to put propaganda towards because I know in Germany it was like very common knowledge that they were very anti-Semitic, but most people didn't really find that surprising because most of the country generally had like an anti-Semitic view. So when it came to the propaganda, they focused more on like against the Japanese and stuff like that rather than the Germans.
Well, I mean, there was actually an anti-Semitic strain in the United States at the time, really based on based more on the immigration from Eastern Europe that had happened like in the 1910s and 1920s that we read about in the Meacham book, right? But the idea was that what was happening in the United States was that the Jews were also considered the enemy because they were foreigners, okay? Plus they were Jewish. And you know, the Jews killed Jesus, right? That's also not historically accurate. But anyway, that was the thinking that people have. It's very simplistic thinking. But that, you know, for example, there had been a ship of refugees from Germany that were Jewish that tried to get into the United States, and they weren't allowed in because they were Jewish, right? You follow me here? Right. So yeah, there is an anti-Semitic strain in the United States, but Roosevelt is going to actually use that racism as his argument, not only against Japan, but also against Germany. Okay.
Didn't we have Japanese internment camps in
Yeah,
America at the time?
we're not there yet, but we're going to get there, right?
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. Good. Any other questions? So you know, this racism that Hitler was able to weaponize doesn't just exist in Germany. It pretty much exists everywhere. And it exists here in the United States today, right? I just read this morning about, and you guys probably know about this, and this is awful, but there's been a lot of attacks against Asian Americans in the United States because people without thinking very much are blaming COVID on Chinese, right? They're saying, well, it's the Chinese that caused it, so let's kill some Asian people. That's going to solve the problem, right? It doesn't solve the problem. In fact, all it does is create disunion. It creates destruction. It doesn't actually create unity. But unlike that, in Germany, because most of the people were white Europeans, they were able to create this feeling of racial unity. Even though the Aryan nation that Hitler talked about, wrote about, was a fiction, it didn't even exist, had never existed historically. His historical thinking was based on myth and fantasy, but nevertheless, people bought it because it sounded good to them, right? You guys are with me? Questions, comments? Okay, well, anyway, so what happens then is that eventually Hitler puts in place his plan. He does actually annex all of these different areas. The only thing that was left was Poland. And in September 1st, 1939, he invaded Poland. He not personally, but the German army invaded Poland. And that was actually what eventually caused the British and the French to declare war. So they declared war in the fall of 1939, but the war didn't really start in earnest until the spring of 1940 when Hitler invaded France. Now, why would they invade France? The reason why was the same as the reason why the Germans invaded France in World War I, which was that their idea was to knock France out of the war quickly so they could focus their efforts on Eastern Europe. Okay, you guys are following here? So the plan was called the Schlieffen Plan. The Germans had tried it in World War I, but had failed. They hadn't actually been able to reach Paris. In World War II, they succeeded, right? And so they knocked France out of the war right off the bat, and then they started to turn their efforts to the East. And it's really going to be in the East where they end up losing the war, but that's a different story altogether, all right? At any rate, the point is that that very quickly in 1940, all of Europe essentially is under the occupation or under the influence of the German Empire. And so basically England stands alone. England is the only country that's really withstanding the German assault. And the biggest reason for that is because they couldn't send tanks across the English Channel. Okay, but so Churchill is the Prime Minister of England, and he's working very hard to try to get the United States involved in the war. Now, keep in mind that we talked about with World War I, the United States and England, or the British, were enemies, really. But after World War I, there was this kind of sense of fraternity between the United States and the British. And Churchill calls upon that, right? So he's going to call upon Roosevelt to work for winning the war for the British, right? Or basically for the West. And Roosevelt will buy it because he sees Hitler and Mussolini as a threat to democracy. Okay, and so there's going to be a series of talks off the coast of Newfoundland called the ABC talks. And the ABC talks, America, British, Canada, America, Britain, Canada, essentially at these talks, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that if the United States ended up going to war with Japan, that the United States would go to war with Germany at the same time, and that the Americans would fight the war in Europe before they fought the war in Asia. All right? It would focus on Europe first, and the reason why was because there was a threat to the Suez Canal, which was the link between the British and their empire in India. You guys follow me here? So essentially what we see is already in place when Pearl Harbor happens is this agreement that the United States is going to send troops to Europe.